value! One vote!
One value!
The 1980s in Queensland was a time of passion and protest. There was, of course, the revelations that were to come out later of police corruption, but there was a belief among many Queenslanders that the root cause of the problems in the state was because the government of the day was unaccountable. Even if the government was unpopular, it could easily get back into power because some votes in some parts of the state were worth up to 3 or 4 times the value of those in other parts of the state. A lot of concerned Queenslanders who believed this formed a group in the mid-1980s called the Citizens for Democracy. It was a non-partisan organisation. It was a group that attempted to communicate with all sides of politics, and its aim was simply to change the electoral system of Queensland to ensure exactly one vote, one value throughout the state. By 1992, Queensland did in fact get fairly close to one vote, one value. This video is the story of the Citizens for Democracy and the campaigns that they ran to keep one vote, one value on the political agenda through the late 1980s into the early 1990s. In 1988, the Citizens for Democracy was seeking a yes vote in a referendum to try and bring fair and democratic elections to this state.
A special sitting of Parliament on May the 10th to introduce referendum bills which, if passed by the people, will reform Australia's constitution. Among the proposed changes will be a 4-year term for Parliament and a vital concern to Queenslanders, a one vote, one value electoral system which would effectively end Queensland's 40-year-old zonal gerrymander. Now, the Hawke government appears to be more willing to go through with the referendum after years of reluctance and obfuscation, with some observers saying it would be one way the government could restore faith with its traditional supporters. In Queensland, the fight against the referendum proposal will be long and bitter. Here it will be 3 major parties against one, however. The Queensland Labor Party, the Queensland Liberals and the Democrats all are committed to one vote, one value. The Nationals, of course, are vehemently opposed because it would eliminate their electoral safeguards through the highly controversial country zone. In a moment we'll be talking to political analyst Dr. Peter Coldrake on the historic decision of the Hawke government and Chris Griffith from the Citizens for Democracy organisation. Vote one value getting up across Australia.
Well, I think it's in for a pretty rough ride. If history is anything to go by, there have been 38 referendum proposals put to the Australian people since Federation, and only 8 of those have been successful. It should be said that for a referendum to be carried, it must be carried by a national majority as well as by a majority of people in a majority of states. So the circumstances are going to be difficult. And one other point that should be remembered is that no referendum has ever been carried where there's been a major disagreement or a disagreement between the major parties.
Right, we'll get to that shortly, but first, Chris Griffith from Citizens for Democracy, what was your reaction to the federal government's newfound reformist zeal?
Well, we're obviously delighted. The referendum proposal's been on the books now for something like 4 years, but at the same time we're quite realistic in appraising what we believe to be the possibilities of success of it. One of the major considerations, of course, is the involvement of community support right throughout Australia to see this proposal get up, because we realise that those who oppose it are capable of spending a lot of money on a campaign against it.
Right, well, let's get to those who oppose it. In Queensland, the National Party will be the only major party against it. I mean, you'll have the Labor Party, the Liberals and the Democrats all in favour of it. So it's got to get up in Queensland, hasn't it?
Well, I'm not sure. It really depends on how hard the Nationals fight it. And although opinion polls in the past have suggested that a majority of people in Queensland do support the abolition of the zonal system, the state government, the National Party, might wage a very strong campaign based on states' rights. And there are, of course, 2 competing principles here. The principles are, on the one hand, one vote, one value, and on the other side, states' rights.
It was worth about 5 times other people's vote. But even worse than that, we have a zonal system in Queensland whereby the government has actually produced a situation where people in the regions where their vote comes from have superior voting rights to people from other regions. And for that reason, they start every election with a tremendous handicap in their favour and against their opposition.
The National Party's primary tally was 39.8%. went and the ALP's tally was 44%. On that basis, no side would have secured, or rather neither of those parties would have secured a majority of seats in their own right. You would have had a coalition led by the National Party on that occasion.
They were the National Party in government in its own right. And if they didn't want to vote in their own right with 50% of the vote, well, they wouldn't have done it. That's 39% of the vote. Why should we get them to be elected on that? No, you can't tell fibs like that. That's the sort of figures that are bandied around by the Labor government. They talk about their last vote last election. And in fact, they counted the preferences last election to win. 39% of the primary vote voted. Well, how many of the Australian Democrats? They've got 7%, and they're telling this nation what to do. The Citizens for Democracy, campaigning for a yes vote on the fair elections question, calls the government's commitment of taxpayers' funds to a partisan case an act of corruption. A short while ago, I chaired this debate between Government Representative Bob Catter Jr. and Sir Vernon Christie, representing the Citizens for Democracy. Sir Vernon Christie, first, can I have your reaction to the government's confirmed decision to spend this money on the No campaign?
Well, I can hardly believe it, really. Like many of my fellow Queenslanders, we thought that the days of the Peterson era, with its lack of principle and all the strange things that happened, we thought they were going to be behind us. But now we have the same old methods, the same old type of playing around with things, and I just can't believe it, like a lot of Queenslanders can't.
Is it justified in your mind?
The campaign or the money?
The money.
Well, anybody that believes in any sort of probity will not use people's money for a campaign to protect a political party, which is what this no vote is. It's to protect the hierarchy of a political party. It's not for the good of the state.
Mr. Catter.
I'm not surprised at the reaction from a person from Victoria. My electorate of Flinders is bigger than the state of Victoria. And if you're going to tell me that a person living in Cloncurry, 600 kilometres from my home in Charters Towers, has representation and the value of his vote and his representation in Parliament equal to that of a person living in Charters Towers, then you would have to have rocks in your head. A person in Charters Towers is a 30-cent telephone call,
Can you,
or half a kilometre around the block.
Before we go into that, can you address yourself, please, to Sir Vernon's complaints about the $800,000 of taxpayers' money to be going on a partisan case?
Let me dismiss two things. One is that the very wildest stretch of my imagination, the maximum number of seats our party would lose if it was forced into this would be 2. In my opinion,
can you address yourself?
Most of the biggest seats, the 10 biggest seats in the state, 6 of them belong to the National
Can
Party.
you address yourself to answering Sir Vernon Christie's complaint about the $800,000 being spent on a partisan case?
Well, he comes from a state where the Premier of that state, Mr. Kane, spent $1 million on opinion polls this year. There can be nothing more party political, if you like, than an opinion poll to tell you what to do and what you should and shouldn't do. And $1 million was spent in that state this year and has never been denied by Mr. Kane. The federal government will spend $15 million at least on this campaign.
Sir Vernon.
I've lived more of my life in Queensland than I've lived in Victoria. Now, let's get that straight. I lived many years in the bush of Queensland. All right. Now, that's the old smoke screen. Trying to protect the political party with taxpayers' money. They're not protecting the people, they're protecting their own power.
I just said to you, we've got two seats.
The power of Sir Robert Sparks and the junta around him.
Well, I've just said that we're protecting 2 seats, as some people would claim. I would claim we're protecting none. And in actual fact, if we were going to go and spend our time, money and effort in doing this, the reason we're doing this is, and I hope that we always react to pressure from the people that are very near and dear to our hearts, so many of the people in the outback of this state who will be left with no representation at all. I come from North Queensland, and we would be one of the few cases anywhere in the world where 750,000 people are governed by a government 1,000 kilometres away in one case and nearly 5,000 kilometres away in another case.
Right, let's deal with that one.
But how poor that case is. Nothing about the 800,000. He's arguing about people in the country who've got very close communication now, just as close as people who live near the cities. What about the 800,000? All you're doing is the old political trick of protecting your party. What about the probity of? What about?
I think we drive very
What
fast.
about the honesty of taking 800,000 to protect Sparks and Co., who, by the way, well, I can understand your problem. And we feel for you, because we remember the reports of the confrontation at Harvey Bay. Members of Parliament have police elections. Who handles the police elections? The house on the hill, the Peterson House. And that's what you're worried about. If you don't play their game and protect them, you're not worried about the people of the state. The principle of this is that the vote counts. Everybody should have a vote equal. That is democracy. That is their state right. A right to one vote, one person. And you haven't answered the 800,000 bit.
I most certainly have answered it, and I answered it by telling you how much our opponents are spending in this election. You are advocating that they spend $15 million and we spend absolutely nothing. Mr. Cain spent $1 million at opinion polls. Let me answer your other point. You should do a little bit of reading about democracy. Two of the founders of modern democratic principles were de Tocqueville, who virtually wrote, if you like, the French Constitution, and Benjamin Franklin, who virtually wrote the American Constitution. Both of them spoke about the tyranny of the majority, and democracy should never, ever become the tyranny of the majority, a means by which the majority can oppress the minority. Now, we are the only country in the world now, as a country, Australia, that does not have some sort of special representation for geographically isolated areas. Right. America, United States, Canada, and even Russia, but not Australia.
Yes, sir. Well, we come back to the 800,000 and the dishonesty of using the people's money to fight this campaign.
We openly talked about it.
You're protecting a political party. You are not interested in protecting the people of the state. The people of the state who are down the south of the state are just as precious as the people up in the north of the state.
And they appreciate that, and you'll see that in the referendum. You'll see that in the referendum.
And the people in the south of the state care just as much for Queensland and for rural Queensland as the people in the north do.
And you will find that they do. Their fairness will come out in the referendum, I can assure you.
Premier Ahern steps up campaign for no votes.
A night of violence in Northern Ireland as IRA terrorist forced across the border.
And Canterbury through to the league grand final. Good evening. Premier Mike Ahern today moved to regain lost ground in the state government's campaign for a no vote in next weekend's constitutional referendum. Mr Ahern's campaign was damaged last week when former Minister Russ Hens admitted Queensland's electoral boundaries are rigged. The Premier now says the poll result, far from being clear-cut, will spark an ongoing legal wrangle.
With the referendum less than a week away, both sides are stepping up their campaigns. Today, a new tactic by Premier Mike Ahern. He says a yes vote won't mean the simple introduction of constitutional change, but just provide a field day for lawyers.
If these legal questions are passed, which are 33 in number, it will reap a tremendous harvest for Australia's lawyers in terms of tens of millions of dollars, all at the expense of the Australian taxpayer.
That's absolute nonsense. All that will happen will be a redistribution in Queensland within the next 12 months.
Citizens for Democracy spokesman Chris Griffith says Mr Ahern is simply trying to cloud the issue.
Mr Griffith says the Premier's statements aren't what's needed now. He says most voters are already confused by Saturday's referendum.
Some believe they must vote the same way for every question.
There are 4 separate referendum issues. The answers to each are counted separately, and people can vote yes to one, no to the other, whatever combination they particularly want to.
Meanwhile, a coalition of church social justice groups today came out in support of question 2. They say there is a moral, not political obligation to vote yes.
And when they analyse the electorates, how they're constituted, it's quite obvious that there's no equality in voting here in the state.
Jane Hodgkinson.
Representatives from various Christian churches has called for Queenslanders to vote yes to question 2 in next Saturday's referendum. They say the yes vote to the fair and democratic election question is important for the common good of the state.
The Joint Churches Social Justice Group is comprised of individuals from all the major Christian churches. Their concern about the Queensland democratic system prompted them to take out a full-page advertisement in a Christian newspaper, urging people to vote yes to the referendum's question 2. They say it's a last-ditched effort to achieve democracy in Queensland.
Just the history of Queensland. We had one party in power for 31 years. We have the term gerrymander continually being referred to, and when you analyse the electorates, how they're constituted, it's quite obvious that there's not equality in voting here in the state.
It's not the first time the Joint Churches Social Justice Group has been in the public eye. In 1985, during the CQUEB crisis, they took a strong stand against the government's actions of sacking workers. Some of them ended up being arrested. Catholic priest Father Richard Pascoe was one of them. Does he feel strong enough about the yes vote to be arrested again?
If it was necessary. I don't think the people in Queensland are that stupid, really, to continue voting no, because the National Party is telling them to. I really don't think they're that stupid.
Government are fighting the next state election on current gerrymandered boundaries. And why not? After spending at least $800,000 of taxpayers' money for the No campaign, Mr Ahern has won an historic battle. So what happens next? Both the Labor and Liberal parties in Queensland remain committed to the removal of the four-zonal system, but they haven't got the numbers to introduce one vote, one value on the floor of Parliament at the moment. So you can see this will now become a major issue in the coming state election.
An electoral reform group says Queenslanders could go to the polls later this year on voting boundaries drawn in part by disgraced former National Party MP Don Lane. The Citizens for Democracy group says Mr Lane had a major role in writing a National Party submission to the state's electoral commissioners in 1985. The group has called on the National Party to make that submission public before the by-election for Mr Lane's former seat of Merthyr.
Citizens for Democracy say the Queensland voters need to know how far the National Party submission went in determining electoral boundaries and promoting the so-called gerrymander.
At the moment in Queensland, whenever people put in submissions to the electoral commissioners, between that time and the time the commissioners draw the boundaries, the whole process is secret.
Chris Griffith, spokesman for the group, says all submissions on electoral changes should be made public, as they are under the federal system. Mr Griffith says in light of the coming by-election in Merthyr, where electoral rolls may be incorrect, voters needed to be certain of a fair system.
At the Merthyr by-election, the National Party will desperately be trying to distance themselves from Don Lane and the activities of Don Lane.
The reform group claims that former sitting member Don Lane was one of the chief authors of the National Party submission to the electoral commissioners in 1985. But Acting Premier Bill Gunn says that's not true. Mr Gunn says Mr Lane was one of a number of MPs able to make a submission on electoral boundaries. He says the party does not need to make its 1985 submission public.
Marked the occasion with a birthday cake covered in black icing, a symbol of what they call a corrupt system.
This was one birthday party where the guests had little to celebrate. It was the anniversary of a day 40 years ago when a then Labor government introduced a new voting system. Today's guest of honour, gerrymander. At the party was a who's who of the left side of politics, as well as church leaders, civil libertarians and political scientists.
It's been a discriminatory system against the people of Brisbane, and it's high time it was changed. We've abused it for 40 years. Let's hope that's been 40 years in the wilderness, and now we're going to have 40 years in the openness. Miserable birthday today to democracy because it doesn't exist in this state.
The gerrymander was introduced by the Labor Party in 1949, and at the time it was fiercely opposed by the Country Party, in particular a young man called Joe Bjelke-Petersen. Years later, the gerrymander became his faithful servant and served him well. Its heartland lies in the country, in one of 4 zones that meanders down the coast inside the Great Dividing Range to sugar towns and rich farmlands. It gives the Nationals the maximum number of electorates and a head start come polling day. In Brisbane, the Citizens for Democracy marked the anniversary of the 4-zonal system by calling for electoral reform and an end to corruption.
Unless something is done to change the electoral malapportionment, nothing fundamental can change in Queensland. It's the very basis of the corrupt Queensland system.
The group wants to make the gerrymander a major political issue at the next state election.
The lobby group Citizens for Democracy held a birthday party, not to honour but to condemn the zonal voting system that has entrenched the National Party government.
It's 40 years since a Labor government introduced the controversial gerrymander, and to mark the occasion, Citizens for Democracy cut a huge cake, complete with 40 candles. The group says it was appropriate such a system was introduced on April Fool's Day. and as well as blowing out commemorative candles, they sought to push the zonal system as a major election issue.
This morning is about the people of Queensland saying to all these political parties, we are fed up, we have an undemocratic system. What we need is an uprising from the people to say we've had enough, 40 years is enough.
Queensland University chaplain Reverend John Woodley says the sort of corruption revealed at the Fitzgerald Inquiry is an unfortunate byproduct of a government entrenched by unfair electoral boundaries.
What I would hope is that Christians might really be Christians in this state for once and begin to take a lead in getting rid of the corruption and immorality, which is what we live with every day.
Citizens for Democracy hope the gerrymander won't have a 41st birthday, with a big enough swing against the government at this year's election, allowing it to be snuffed out for good. Peter Kelly, 10 News.
To review the electoral boundaries.
Parliament sat late last night, but it rose before many members had managed to have their say on the Fitzgerald report. Time for debate was delayed this week by the resignation of the Speaker, and the opposition failed to gain an extension. When Parliament resumes at the end of August, the House will debate legislation on a commission to review the electoral boundaries. But the Premier hasn't ruled out the possibility of a boundaries tribunal to decide the changes. That's angered community groups who met today.
We don't need another tribunal. We've got the police constraints tribunal. We've had that process. We need a far more independent mechanism for drawing the state's electoral boundaries.
A poll of 600, commissioned by the Courier Mail, has found that 85% of people, randomly telephoned, want the state's electoral boundaries reviewed. Only 28% believe Mr Ahern would implement the Fitzgerald report's recommendations, while 43% thought the opposition leader would. The community groups have called for a referendum to decide if the term of the government should be extended so the new electoral boundaries could be implemented before the next election.
We want democracy! What do we want? Democracy!
With police permission, they marched up George Street, and by the time they'd reached the Roma Street Forum, their number had increased significantly.
1989 is the year that the Empire strikes back.
Constable Pike was optimistic too.
We will win democracy in this state, and we will have a police force which will truly protect and serve all of the people, not just the elite.
Sir Vernon Christie urged the protesters to continue their outspoken criticisms in the streets, in the media and at the ballot box.
This is a great step forward in the beginning of the end of an evil and bad government.
We have had an authoritarian, fundamentalist, chauvinist cabinet government.
Renegade policeman Peter Pike received a standing ovation.
It's a great day for Queensland because apathy died today.
To make submissions on electoral boundaries. The invitation comes before Parliament establishes the Electoral Review Commission recommended in the Fitzgerald report. Community groups have welcomed the move and are urging the public to contribute.
Queensland is currently divided into 4 electoral zones. The so-called gerrymander means that in the last election, the National Party won 50% of the seats with just 39% of the vote. Queenslanders are being urged to make submissions for new boundaries to the Electoral and Administrative Review Commission.
We are delighted to see these ads because now, for the first time ever, Queenslanders have got an official say into the future of their electoral system.
While Citizens for Democracy are campaigning for one vote, one value, they say everyone must make a submission regardless of the outcome of the October 14 referendum.
At the moment, all the electoral emphasis has been on the referendum. We think it's now better put on to putting in submissions to this group. It's our first opportunity. If we don't take that opportunity up, it'll be criminal.
The Electoral Review Commission will be officially formed next week when the government passes a special bill. To speed up the review process, the government has called for submissions to be ready soon.
Pride of place belonged to this 4-metre-high Lady of Liberty and Justice.
One vote, one value, fair elections now.
From city streets, the protesters moved to a rally at the Roma Street Forum, where they were entertained by Judith Durham and harangued by a variety of speakers.
We, the poor bloody public, fools that you take us for, will ensure that Fitzgerald's resignation does not mark the first significant nail
in the coffin of his reform process.
The outcome was a motion thanking Commissioner Fitzgerald for his uncompromising and dedicated work in the interests of democracy and accountable government. Peter McCarthy, Eyewitness News.
When do we want it? Now!
Queensland's second legal street march in a month ran smoothly, with police help, but the crowd today was not as big as the Democracy March last month. Electoral reform, official corruption and misuse of public funds all received a loud airing. And the resignation recently of Anti-Corruption Commissioner Tony Fitzgerald was also prominent.
What do we want, citizens? When do we want it? Now!
The marchers crossed King George Square in the city centre where protest gatherings are not allowed, but they were not challenged or stopped. At the forum, speeches concentrated on electoral reform as the state draws closer to a general election later this year.
That this rally thanks Tony Fitzgerald QC for the uncompromising and dedicated way in which he conducted his inquiry and delivered recommendations in the interests of democracy and accountable government.
We shall
Environmental groups supported the rally, organised by the Citizens for Democracy. This morning, they linked hands around the three accessible sides of the House in an attempt to show that the government belongs to the people.
A human chain of 300 people stretched around two sides of the Parliament House perimeter fence.
Some of the more dedicated demonstrators lit candles and spent the night in sleeping bags in George Street. Their numbers increased after dawn, and by 8 o'clock 300 people had gathered to join hands around the outside of Parliament. With Saturday's state election in mind, a variety of community action groups, Christians and a serving police officer who's standing as an ALP candidate combined forces. Cleaning the state of corruption was the issue uppermost in their minds, and they thought it was timely to remind people. A minister of religion speaking on Good Morning Australia likened the protest to an exorcism.
We're trying to exorcise the evil that we've experienced over the last certainly 10 years in this state and hoping that in this way we can have a new beginning.
Protest organisers were delighted with the turnout, considering most of those who showed up had to rush off to work at 8:30.
Well, it's a statement about reform, and reform does cut across political barriers, but it's important that in the election that we focus in Queensland on the state issues.
The demonstrators were urged to return on election night.
I'm here to participate in an exercise of hope, and the hope is for effective democracy in this state.
This is all national.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm just trying to work this out.
The new Queensland political picture hand-delivered to Parliament House this morning. Good evening, I'm Ellen Carpenter. Thanks for joining us. Pamela Bornhorst is in Sydney tonight, joining Four Corners' 30th birthday celebrations. Queensland's political system changed inexorably today, the death of the notorious gerrymander. Under the so-called zonal system, Joe Bjelke-Petersen was able to rule with just 18% of the vote. The Fitzgerald Inquiry heard how even the police had an interest in election boundaries. Today, an independent commission, which grew out of the inquiry, brought down its recommendations. A total of 25 seats have disappeared and new seats created. Greg Turnbull followed the day's events.
Thank you. That's fine. Is that the lot of them, is it? Well, actually, I just select them there. Great. Thank you. Here they are. Let's go.
Thank you, Sue. Bye-bye.
Jim Forrest, the Speaker of the Queensland Parliament, takes delivery of the state's new political picture. After 40 years of notoriety, the Queensland electoral system has been drastically reformed. The zonal gerrymander is out, one vote, one value is in. Well, almost.
Jim, is the large map on display here too?
No.
I know it's at
You've
Sun
got to go
Map.
up to either George Street where the BR place is or where you've got Sun Map. So both the large maps will be there.
Across Brisbane City, journalists and other observers queued to discover the boundaries on which the next Queensland election will be fought, probably next year.
Well, this is probably one of the most historic days in Queensland's history, because now this state is joining the rest of the Commonwealth in having near to a one vote, one value system with boundaries for the first time for years and years impartially drawn.
Impartially drawn by this group of people, the Electoral and Administrative Review Commission, an independent body recommended by the Fitzgerald report. The boundaries recommended by this committee today, subject to minor changes in response to public submissions, will finally end the so-called Queensland zonal gerrymander. It was a system introduced by Labor for its own advantage in 1949, then refined and used against it by the Country Party, later the National Party, of Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen. It divided the state into 4 geographic zones: the southeastern zone, the provincial cities, the country zone, and western and far northern electorates. The allowance given to the distances and sparse population of the western zone created the following often quoted disparity. Premier Wayne Goss's urban seat of Logan has more than 30,000 voters, while Russell Cooper's western seat of Roma has around 8,000. Under the proposals unveiled today, the zonal system is no more. The 89 old seats are scrapped and replaced by 89 new seats, based largely on one vote, one value. Take 1.8 million voters, divide them by the number of seats, 89, and you get the new electorate quota, some 20,000 voters. All of the electorates unveiled today are meant to have no more voters than the quota, plus or minus 10%. Except that seats of more than 100,000 square kilometres are effectively exempt from the quota. They are Charters Towers, Cook and Mount Isa in the far north, and Gregory and Warrego in the west. Under a formula devised by the Electoral Review Committee, Gregory, for instance, gets away with having just under 15,000 voters compared to the quota of around 20,000.
Well, the Premier called it an historic occasion, an end to Queensland's 40-year-old gerrymander. Legislation to enable a total redistribution of electorates was approved by Cabinet today. It should be before Parliament by the end of the week. The actual boundaries will be drawn up later in the year by an independent commissioner. Today the Premier spoke in glowing terms about the new laws, saying, and I quote, "They enshrine the concept of one vote, one value," unquote. Well, not quite. The fact is, effectively, Queensland is not getting one vote, one value, but a two-zonal system. Voters in some remote parts of the state will find their vote worth more than those in other parts of the state. It's a compromise the Labor Party says it's prepared to accept, in line with the recommendations of EARC, the Electoral and Administrative Review Commission. But many in the ALP are unhappy with the decision, including the party's own parliamentary committee set up to oversee EARC's work. Earlier today we asked the Secretary of the Queensland Labor Party, Wayne Swan, to debate the issue with Chris Griffiths from the Watchdog Committee, which has described the government's decision as hypocritical and a disgrace. Mr. Swan, if I could ask you first, the ALP for years fought for one vote, one value. It was very much a part of the political rhetoric. Why now are you prepared to accept less than that?
Well, we have achieved one vote, one value, except we haven't achieved it in all of the seats. We've achieved it in 84 out of the 89 seats. And during the state election campaign, Wayne Goss and all his candidates, including the Labor Party organisation, promised that we would implement fully the recommendations of EARC. We're disappointed that EARC has not chosen to recommend one vote, one value in 89 seats. Instead, they've recommended it in 84. But nevertheless, we made a pledge to the people of Queensland, and if we want to have public trust in the government, in the electoral system, if we want to end the abuse of parliamentarians rigging the system, drawing the boundaries, then we have to support the EARC recommendations.
But surely you, as an ALP official, should be pursuing ALP policy.
Yes, I am, and I will continue to pursue ALP policy.
But you didn't in this regard.
Well, I'm sorry, you have misquoted the report, as have many other people. We continue to support one vote, one value, but we were required to make a judgment about the totality of EARC's recommendations. EARC has recommended an independent electoral commission. They recommended substantially one vote, one value with a minor departure, and all of the things that Chris Griffith and I have fought for over the years have been recommended with one minor variation. we had to take a judgment about what the package means, and we think that it will produce a fair electoral outcome. It means in practice only one extra seat in Western and far northern Queensland if we didn't have one vote, one vote, one value.
Well, Mr Griffiths, he says it's just a minor variation. You obviously don't agree with that.
Not at all. You either have one vote, one value, or you don't have one vote, one value. We've got a situation now where we're going to have the electorates in the west of Queensland, some of which will have votes worth twice those of the rest of the state. What we want to see is equitable elections with people having an equal say in determining the outcome of that election. And that's not what this particular system is going to bring about.
But what's going to be the effect of this? The government says it won't have much effect.
Well, it'll have an effect in a couple of seats. Probably 6 seats in all will be involved in the weighting of votes. But that can have an effect on the outcome of the election. We have a situation in South Australia, for example, where the Bannon government is elected with a 1-seat majority. It depends on the support of 2 independent Labor members to govern. So we've got to be able to get election results that give the fair result. We can't say that 1 or 2 seats either way is good enough.
So you're saying this will leave the system open to abuse, and that's what we're supposed to be getting rid of?
Exactly. In fact, it's not me who's saying that, it's the EARC Parliamentary Committee report that's saying that. And we're concerned that now the government and Cabinet have looked at the legislation, it's not taking any notice of those concerns expressed in that EARC Parliamentary Committee report. For example, the legal standing of EARC's recommendation for weightage, the fact that the Parliamentary Committee found the formula as arbitrary, and also that it regarded that there was other ways of assisting members servicing remote electorates. So none of those particular concerns were taken into account by Cabinet today, and we're disappointed.
But it's a fait accompli, isn't it, really? There's not much you can do about it now.
Well, it's a fait accompli if the government decides it's a fait accompli. As far as we're concerned, the debate's going to go on. In fact, the Parliamentary Committee report's shown that the debate needs to go on, and there has to be further changes to the electoral system.
Is there any chance of change, Mr Swan?
Well, not in this term of the Goss Labor government, because the Premier gave his word, as did all Labor members of Parliament, that they would uphold the umpire's decision. I recall clearly during the election campaign being asked by people like Chris Griffith to commit the Labor Party to following the umpire's decision. Now, it's a sad day for Mr Griffith and a sad day for many of us when the umpire decided to do something that we didn't want it to do. But if we're going to have some faith in this electoral system and people are going to believe that the government is not interfering in that process, then the decision had to be upheld. It's a disappointment to me as much as it is a disappointment to Chris. But that's what independent arbiters are for, and the government has upheld the arbiter's decision.
Well, I'd like to correct Wayne Swan on one point there, and that is that before the election, the group I was associated with said surveys to all members of Parliament and all candidates asking for their commitment not to the Fitzgerald process but to 1 vote, 1 value. And we've even got a submission or we've even got a survey back from the Premier basically giving that commitment. So that's not the case. And we went, in terms of the election, before the election, we were quite clear on our commitment to 1 vote, 1 value.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much, both of you, for coming in.
Thank you.